Isaac Hart presents Ghost in the Museum. Welcome back to the Ghost in the Museum podcast. This is episode 4. Just the usual quick updates before we begin with this month's story. Thank you to everyone who listened to and downloaded episode 3, Beloved Son Asleep. It was a very long and pretty heavy one, so I really do appreciate everyone who listened in. I've been really pleased with all the feedback I've received for that one. I've had loads of people tell me that they thought it was particularly scary, which I'm very pleased with, of course, because this is a podcast for ghost stories and they're meant to be scary. I had one person tell me how sorry they felt for poor old Miles. I really did put him through the ringer. So going forward, I'm going to try and keep these things to under an hour or near an hour. I think 90 minutes is pushing it for some, and listening to these things in 10 or 15 minute chunks probably breaks up the action somewhat. So this month's story is actually the shortest I've written for the show so far. I hope the latest tweak to the format works. Anyone who follows our Instagram page, which is at ghostmuseum_podcast, will have seen that we're now on YouTube too. So you can listen to all the episodes of the show on YouTube as videos. Finally, some exciting news. Fairly soon, I'm going to be launching a second podcast, believe it or not. Well, I say launching, I'll actually be running a second podcast for the Southport and Birkdale Classical Association, of which I'm a member. I recently became their tech guy. My undergraduate degree is in digital media, so I'm very au fait with recording, editing, audio and video. So I've been put in charge of setting up and running the official YouTube and Spotify pages for the association to share their lectures with the members or anyone who wants to give them a listen. I'll share it to the main Instagram page once those are all approved and have gone live. It's a very exciting thing to get to use all of these skills for something I enjoy, and I'm looking forward to getting to share these really fascinating lectures from some world-class experts in their fields with all of you. Now on to today's story. Like I said, it's a shorter one. I didn't really have much of a choice in the matter, as I've been probably busier than I've ever been in my life. Like I say, I've been working with Southport Classics. I've had a lovely holiday with my girlfriend, so not much time to write, but that's been good. I think it's made things a bit leaner and meaner. We get into the action a bit quicker than before on this one. This story, it's kind of the oldest story I've told yet, parts of it, because parts of it come from a very vivid dream, nightmare I had when I was about 6 or 7 years old that's stuck with me, nearly 20 years now. So the core of this story, I was really pulling on that little trauma. So yes, I hope you enjoy it. I call this little chiller the Ran-Tan-Zee. Amy knew that the old man was going to talk to her the moment she laid her eyes on him. She sighed, her breath mingling with the still air in the Booth Museum. The man in the mustard-stained jacket, an oddity in a place where visitors were usually scarce, entered the gallery with a hesitant shuffle. The tap of his worn-out shoes on the linoleum floor had announced his presence before Amy even looked up, and as soon as she did, she knew that there would be no escape. Setting aside her book, she rose from her chair, her gaze fixed on the approaching figure. A strand of lank brown hair fell across her face and she brushed it away with a distracted motion. The man, stooped and grey-bearded, wielded a carved wooden cane that echoed against the silent walls as he moved. The gallery, bathed in the soft glow of spring sunlight filtering through the windows, should have been filled with the laughter of families and the murmur of curious visitors. Instead, it was quiet. Row upon row of stuffed birds in glass cases and fossilised trilobites on racks sitting silent and still. The absence of the usual chatter made Amy's anticipation of the man's approach even more pronounced. Brighton had enjoyed a bright, pleasant spring afternoon, tempting most people to bask on the beach or venture into the Sussex countryside. Normalcy dictated that the Booth Museum, with its preserved relics of the past, would be an afterthought on such a day, but here he was, this peculiar man, navigating through the eerie silence, leaving Amy with a feeling of inevitability. As the man drew closer, Amy couldn't help but wonder what compelled him to forsake the sunshine for the musty embrace of the taxidermised creatures. She'd expected solitude during her shift, the exhibits and their glass eyes her only company as she finished her book, yet fate had delivered this lone visitor, disrupting the quiet routine of the museum and, unwittingly, Amy's solitude. The man's slow progress towards her stirred a sense of restlessness within Amy. She wondered if the pebble beach and the cries of gulls would be a more satisfying backdrop to her day than the silent company of meticulously preserved creatures. Thoughts of abandoning the quiet gallery for the vibrant life outside crossed her mind. She could lie on the sun-kissed shore, her book in hand, and let the rhythmic lull of the waves replace the eerie stillness of the museum. However, duty held her in place. The old man, with each deliberate tap of his cane on the floor, inched closer, an inevitable encounter in the making. Amy recognised the type, the visitor who carried the weight of untold stories, the kind who, with a single glance, revealed a desire to share their entire life history. It had been 3 years since she took on the role of a gallery attendant, yet she still grappled with how to navigate these encounters. The impending conversation loomed, and Amy prepared herself for the familiar pattern, long, winding narratives on one side and muted acknowledgements on the other. She couldn't fathom how to respond to these individuals who, in their desperation and isolation, sought solace in the museum's quiet corners. Still, Amy felt a responsibility, a compassionate acknowledgement that she might be the only person these visitors had spoken to in days. The old man's shuffle slowed, and he eventually came to a stop by one of the glass cases. His hand, shaking with arthritis, rested on the head of his cane. Amy observed as he gazed into the diorama before him. A tatty-looking spider monkey, frozen in a grotesque display, clung miserably to a branch. The dried, stretched skin around its mouth accentuated a grimace, and its small, dark hands were cruelly pinned to the branch with nails. A pang of guilt pierced Amy's thoughts, a reminder of the faintly heretical nickname she and her fellow gallery attendants had given the crucified creature, a moniker born more out of boredom than malice. As the old man stood there, lost in contemplation, Amy wrestled with the internal conflict between the duty to engage and the discomfort sparked by the macabre scene before them. As Amy's attention shifted from the melancholy display of Monkey Christ, her eyes refocused, and the reflection of the old man materialised in the glass. The simian's misery blurred, giving way to the clearer contours of the man standing before it. It was then that Amy truly looked at his face, beyond the wiry halo of his beard and the thinning white strands of his hair. However, it was the eyes that captivated her. Wide with fear, fixated on the shrivelled husk of the monkey. The terror etched in the old man's gaze held Amy momentarily rooted to a spot beside the tall information label chronicling the museum's history. The label detailed the legacy of the eponymous Mr. Booth, the man who had meticulously shot and stuffed every conceivable British bird before posthumously gifting his collection to the bewildered Brighton Corporation. The old man's eyes seemed to harbour a revulsion that Amy had never witnessed before, as though he wished to cringe away from the macabre spectacle, but found himself rooted in place, just like the monkey affixed to its branch. Amy, entranced, observed as the old man's fearful gaze flicked from the pitiful creature to her own reflection in the glass. Startled by the sudden connection, Amy averted her eyes with undue haste, fearing that the old man might misconstrue her intent. She then embarked on a deliberate, slow meander in the opposite direction, adopting the casual demeanour of a gallery attendant with hands behind her back. Her heart raced, and a sense of unease settled within her. The old man's eyes, fraught with fear, lingered in her thoughts, an unsettling presence that she couldn't quite shake. Amy sensed the old man's eyes lingering on her back, and she feigned intense interest in the case of taxidermised butterflies. Each delicate specimen had its heart pierced by a pin, affixed to a cork board in a macabre display. The silence of the gallery hung heavy, broken only by the shuffling of the old man and the muted sounds of Amy's own uneasy breaths. Abruptly, a voice cut through the stillness. "Excuse me," croaked the old man. Amy paused, her hesitation palpable, lingering longer than she ever allowed herself to. The sudden unease around this visitor puzzled her. She couldn't pinpoint why his presence had unsettled her so. Amy recalled her girlfriend Kara's words, how she had laughed at her aversion to even dead spiders in their flat, contrasting with her daily immersion in a building teeming with preserved creatures. "No wonder you're so jumpy," Kara had laughed. She was always so light, Amy thought to herself. Maybe it was because Kara had a real job, as her own mother had put it. Working for the family skip business wasn't quite the line of work Amy would choose to be in for herself, but Kara seemed to genuinely enjoy it, and on days like this, Amy wondered if she could do with a little more physical exertion and interaction in her life. The old man spoke again. Excuse me, miss?" His voice carried a delicate, slightly upper-class quality, as if his accent were cut from glass. Breaking from her contemplation, Amy spun on her heels, donning an open expression and a smile that was just a shade too wide. "Oh, hello," she chirped, pretending as if she had just become aware of the man's presence. "How can I help?" For the first time, Amy and the old man were face to face. He seemed oblivious to her earlier unease. A moment of silence passed as he wobbled on his cane, his hand gesturing limply at the case with the stuffed monkey. His mouth moved, but words struggled to form. Amy felt a peculiar tension in the air, as if the man were on the verge of tears. Finally, he spoke, his voice quivering with uncertainty. "I'm sorry," he began. "I'm sorry to bother you, miss, but is it dead?" Amy's smile faltered as she grappled with the question, convinced she had misheard. "Is it dead?" she repeated, seeking clarification. "The monkey?" The old man visibly cringed at the mere mention of the word, bowing his head. Amy couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Yes," she replied gently, speaking to the man as kindly as possible. The monkey's dead, sir. It's taxidermy. Like the rest of the exhibit. See? It's stuffed." The old man's gaze remained fixed on the creature, haunted by a question that seemed to carry a weight far beyond the simplicity of its words. His eyes darted back and forth between the stuffed monkey and Amy, wide with fear. "But how can you tell?" he asked, his anxiety palpable. "How do you know that it's dead? It's got its skin and its bones. How do you know that it's just not standing very, very still?" Amy was momentarily silenced, her confusion evident as she regarded the old man. She had anticipated an odd conversation, but the blatant absurdity of his suggestion caught her off guard. Typically armed with a repertoire of non-committal noises and phrases for these elderly visitors, Amy found herself at a loss for an appropriate response. The earnestness in the old man's eyes, the fear that lingered, gave her pause. For a moment, a seldom used, lizard-like part of her brain considered the question seriously. How did she know that the monkey was dead? That any of the creatures were? The idea took root briefly, and she pictured the small monkey on its branch, eyes flicking imperceptibly to track her across the gallery when her back was turned. The unsettling thought sent a shiver down her spine, snapping her out of the momentary contemplation. Shaking her head a little too aggressively, Amy tried to regain her composure. "Well," she said, attempting to infuse a lightness into her tone with a half-joke, "I've not seen it move." The old man continued to study the monkey, seemingly unconvinced. His eyes reflected a mixture of desperation and a peculiar sincerity that made Amy question whether he was playing a strange game or genuinely grappling with an unsettling doubt. Suddenly he seemed to buckle, his cane slipping from his grasp and clattering loudly to the floor. Amy's instincts kicked in and she dashed forward to catch him before he fell. "God, are you all right?" she asked, genuine concern etching her features. The old man struggled to catch his breath, his body betraying signs of distress. Amy guided him, half leading and half carrying, over to her vacant chair. "Hang on, you take a seat," she insisted, gently settling him down. Returning to pick up his fallen cane, Amy noticed its peculiar carving. A python's head forming the handle, its body twisting down to shape the curved shaft. Empty sockets suggested the absence of glass eyes, adding an eerie quality to the serpent-like carving. Amy retrieved the cane and, recalling the rarely used collapsible plastic chairs, grabbed one from the hooks at the gallery entrance. These chairs were hardly ever employed, as visitors seldom lingered for more than 15 minutes in this particular gallery or an hour in the museum itself. Amy returned to the old man, whose heavy breathing had slowed, indicating an effort to regain composure. "There you go," she said, handing back the cane. "Oh, thank you," the old man whispered, clutching the cane tightly to his chest. Amy opened the collapsible chair and took a seat opposite him, abandoning any thoughts of dismissing him as she might have done with other difficult visitors. "Are you okay?" Amy asked once more, her concern evident. "Do you need me to call you an ambulance?" The old man shook his head. I'll be all right," he reassured her, his voice still hoarse. "I just had a funny turn." He looked up at Amy, his frightened eyes softening as they peered from under his bushy white eyebrows. "I'm awfully sorry to give you such a fright, miss," he apologised sincerely. Any lingering fear Amy felt towards the old man dissolved. He had been nothing but polite, despite his peculiar fixation with the monkey in the case. Amy offered him a reassuring smile. "It's no problem at all, sir," she said. "You take all the time you need to get your breath back." She searched for something to say as the old man continued to slow his breathing, still clutching his cane. "That's a very nice cane," she remarked, attempting to fill the silence. "I love the handle." He offered a faint smile. "Oh, thank you. It was my father's." As if on cue, he seemed to recover himself. "I apologise for my rudeness," he said, stretching out his hand. "I'm George." Amy, surprised by the sudden shift, gamely shook his hand in return. "Amy," she introduced herself. "You've been very kind to me, Amy." George expressed his gratitude. Amy took in George's appearance once more. His voice and manners spoke of a well-educated man, yet his exterior appeared scruffy and careworn, untrimmed hair and beard, patchy and stained clothes. Amy surmised he must live alone, doggedly dressing himself despite his apparent ill health. "Is there anyone who can take you home, George?" Amy asked with concern. George shook his head. "I don't live in Brighton," he explained. "I'm only a visitor, but I did grow up near here, in Lewis." George's connection to the village resonated with Amy. "Oh, Lewis," she smiled at him. "My grandparents live there. It's lovely. I always used to love visiting the castle and the priory there." Her warmth elicited a half-smile from George. "I used to love that castle too," he said. "My parents had a house near the Mount, by the village green." After a moment of quiet, Amy ventured to ask the lingering question. "George," she began, "why did you decide to visit us at the museum today? You don't particularly seem to like stuffed animals that much." George, more reticent than she had anticipated, studied the head of his cane intently before answering. "I needed reassurance," he confessed. Amy furrowed her brow. "Reassurance? About what?" George looked her in the eyes with complete earnestness. "That a stuffed animal is really dead, because I'm not really sure at all." Amy looked at George with a mixture of confusion and concern. Earlier she had considered the possibility that his mind had been clouded by age, but their conversation revealed that he possessed all of his faculties. This fact alone made his uncertainty about stuffed animals chilling in a way Amy had never experienced. The hundreds of glassy eyes staring out from the glass cases around them suddenly seemed more present and the silence more pronounced. "Why wouldn't you be sure about that, George?" Amy asked, her genuine curiosity evident. George sighed. "I know that you think I must be some terrible old duffer," he began. "Losing my wits, scared of stuffed animals." Amy shook her head. "I don't, George," she reassured him. "People are scared of things for a reason." She hesitated for a moment before finding herself opening up despite herself. "I don't like spiders," she confessed. "They've always freaked me out, even when they're dead. My girlfriend's always making fun of me because I work in this place." She gestured at the glass cabinet. "But I won't even touch a dead spider." Amy searched George's face for the telltale twitch of disapproval she sometimes encountered when mentioning Kara, but found none. Instead, she saw a warm smile on his face, which she returned. Encouraged, Amy continued. "I know it's silly, but I found one on my pillow when I was little, and I've never liked them since." George nodded slowly. "You're a very perceptive young woman," he said quietly, "and you're right. I am scared of stuffed animals, and I do have a good reason." He leaned back in the chair, bathed in the warm glow of spring sunlight streaming through the skylight of the gallery. His eyes were closed, lost in reminiscence, and Amy found herself spellbound. The mystery behind George's fear of the stuffed monkey compelled her, and she leaned in, eager to hear his story. "I was a very timid child," he began, his voice carrying a wavering undertone of uncertainty. "I got frightened very easily. I used to think that the dressing gown hanging on my door was some terrible spook, things like that." Amy could sense the trauma in George's voice as he continued. "When I was about 9 or 10, my parents had had enough. My father..." George paused, considering the cane, turning it in his hands. "My father was a very proud man, very strong. He fought in North Africa during the war. He bought this cane in a souk in Cairo, or so he always told me." George looked at the cane fondly for a moment, then bit his lip. "I was a disappointment to him," he confessed. "He thought I was a terrible sissy. He never knew what to do with me or how to talk to me. Gripping the cane tightly, his gnarled knuckles whitening with the pressure, George looked at Amy with pleading, hurt eyes. "Your girlfriend," he said. "Do you love her?" Amy was taken aback, but George's vulnerability softened her. She thought of Kara, her smile, her tan skin, her short dark hair. "Yeah," Amy replied with a smile. "I do." Closing his eyes, George held the cane close to his chest. "That's good," he whispered. "Oh, there should be more love in this world." He blinked back the tears. "All I did was hold that boy's hand." George trailed off, the pain in his words carrying a world of hurt and rejection that Amy all too well understood. She gently placed a hand on George's knee. "I'm sorry," she said earnestly. George continued his story, his voice carrying the weight of the painful memories. "After that, my father lost it," he explained. "Told me that if he ever saw me do that again, he wouldn't be responsible for what happened to me." George emphasised his words by whacking the cane down on his outstretched palm, causing Amy to wince. She understood the harsh reality of the era and the brutality that might have been inflicted on a man of George's age. Sniffing loudly as if trying to regain his composure, George continued. "It was the summer term. He decided that I should go and live with my mother's uncle to toughen me up. 'Colonel Fulton will make a man out of you yet, boy.' That's what my father said to me." The way George bellowed the name Colonel Fulton sent a chill down Amy's back. "They sent you away? When you were 9? Amy said, aghast. George set down the cane against the wall. "The Colonel lived in the country, at a farm called Longburn near Alfriston. It was miles away from anywhere, and I remember how cold it would get, even during the summer." Amy could hardly fathom the frightened little boy being deposited at the country farmhouse, quivering with fear. "I was quite alone there," George said. "The Colonel had no wife, so it was just me and him and the woman from the village who came to change his linens. I thought my father had been cruel. The Colonel! Oh, it was the most wretched summer of my life." George wore a desolate expression, and Amy couldn't help but feel the weight of his pain. "I was little better than another servant," George explained. "The Colonel had lost a leg Gallipoli, and a man of his class was never up for much work in any case. For the 3 months I lived with him, I was up from dawn to dusk. I scrubbed the floors, I cooked the meals. He made me run laps of the fields around the farm in just my undergarments and flogged me if he thought I cheated." Amy was repulsed by Fulton's cruelty and abuse of young George. "That's awful," she said. "Why would he treat you like that?" George gave Amy a curious look. "The Colonel had been born in India," George continued, "or the Raj as it was in those days. His father, my great-grandfather, had fought the sepoys during the mutiny, and the Colonel and my mother's mother had been brought up in a house in Jaipur with Indian manservants and peacocks in the grounds. If you heard the way the Colonel told it, that house was the ideal state of nature, and he despaired very loudly that he was ending his days in an English farmhouse and not an Indian palace. This was just a few years after the British pulled out, you see, and he had very wicked things to say about Gandhi and Nehru and anyone else he thought had taken away what he was in the firm belief was his by birthright." Amy sat mesmerised as George told his story. It was unlike any of the other rambling narratives she had heard from elderly visitors to the gallery. George's words vividly conjured up a lost world of oriental opulence. A passage to India came to mind. She remembered her and Kara had watched it on Netflix a few months earlier. "Longburn Farm itself was this wretched, tumble-down old wreck of a place," George continued. "The Colonel had neither the inclination nor the ability for its upkeep, and was too much of a miser to ever employ more than 1 or 2 people on his pension. So when I was there, it was like the whole building was falling to bits. The insides were a hodgepodge of different parts, as if it had been torn down and rebuilt a half-dozen times. I think it must have belonged to the Priory once. Wilmington Priory, yes. It had these great sandstone walls behind the wallpaper in my room." Amy was dimly aware that as George had been speaking, no one else had come into the gallery. Not even the other 2 attendants that she knew usually did their rounds. She wondered if Mark and Louise had packed it in for the day and headed for the beach, as she had been considering, and had simply left her to lock the place up. "Was it something there that scared you, George?" Amy asked. hoping to nudge him in the direction of the point. George tensed up, and Amy could see his eyes flood with dread again as they flicked back to the stuffed monkey in its case. Amy looked over too, half expecting to see that the tatty little creature had moved an arm or a leg while she'd been looking away. She gulped.
"There are big parts of the house. Neither me nor the Colonel ever went in," George said. "He spent nearly all his time in the drawing room, up on the first floor, in an armchair in front of the fireplace. He'd put the stump of his leg on a little stool and just sit there for hours, a glass in his hand. He'd sit there, and he'd talk to it." The way George emphasised the word "it" made Amy's blood run cold. "It?" she asked. George leaned forward, eyes wide with fear. "The Ran-Tan-Zee," he whispered. "The Ran-Tan what?" Amy asked, confused. George was in full flow, as if all these stories were pouring out of him after years of being bottled up, as if he had been waiting to find the right person to tell them to. "The Ran-Tan-Zee," George repeated. "The Ran-Tan-Zee was an ape. A stuffed ape that stood on a dark wooden plinth in the corner of the Colonel's drawing room, clinging onto a dead piece of wood, like that little one, over there. But it was enormous. Enormous to me as a boy. It was taller than my father." Amy's mind whirled for a moment. Ran-Tan-Zee, she thought to herself. Something about the strange, cobbled-together name of the thing made her uncomfortable. Was this thing an orangutan, a chimpanzee? The way George talked about it, so filled with dread and disgust, felt like it was emanating off him in waves. "Oh, it was such a horrid thing," George whispered. "I remember the first time I saw it, I almost jumped out of my skin. I knew what chimpanzees and gorillas looked like. They had tame ones in the Tarzan films they would show at the cinema. But this thing... Oh, it was like nothing I'd ever seen, not even in a picture book. It looked like it was stitched together, like it was made from bits and pieces of 4 or 5 different apes. Like how they used to put a monkey's head on a fish and say it was a mermaid found washed up on a beach." Amy was transfixed by the description. "Stitched together? Like Frankenstein?" she asked. George visibly shivered. "Oh, it was covered in this patchy, matted orange fur, and it had long, long arms that stretched all the way to the floor, and these huge, leathery hands, and its face. Oh, it had those great flaps of flesh that an orangutan has, and these beady little black eyes that would follow you around the room, and its mouth. Oh, the mouth was the worst of it. All the skin of its face was dried up and mummified, and it had pulled back around the teeth, its razor-sharp teeth in that horrid, twisted grin. I hated it, Amy. I hated the very sight of the blasted thing." Amy hated the very description of the thing, so God knows what feelings the very sight of it would have inspired in her. "That's why you're afraid of stuffed animals," Amy said. "You had that thing in the place you were so unhappy." To her surprise, George shook his head. "You don't understand," he whispered. "It wasn't just the way it looked. It was the things that it did. It was what it said." Amy was quiet. Once again she found herself blindsided by the things George said with such deadly seriousness. "The things that it said. The things that the ape said," she queried. George was silent a little longer. "As soon as I saw it, it terrified me," he began. "I was scared of almost everything, like I said, but this thing, above all others, filled me with dread. I begged the Colonel to cover it up so that I wouldn't have to pass it when I bought him his drink, but he just smacked me around the head like this." George mimed a smacking motion against his knee that made Amy jump. "He shouted at me, 'Don't you dare disrespect the Ran-Tan-Zee, you stupid boy! He can hear everything you say about him and he'll remember it all.' It wasn't like the other times he had shouted at me. It was like he was telling me off, like I'd been about to touch a hot stove. It was like he knew something dreadful would happen if he didn't put a stop to it right then and there." George shook his head, as if trying to shake the memory away. Amy leaned forward. "The Colonel, he acted like it was alive?" Amy asked in astonishment. George's eyes met Amy's.
"Like it was," he whispered. "Like it was alive."
He let the question hover in the air, like a poison cloud. Amy stared at George in disbelief. "It can't have been alive, George," she said slowly, as if she were trying to reassure part of herself, that lizard brain that had been going haywire ever since George had walked into the gallery. "It was mummified, stuffed, standing on a plinth. What would make you think it was alive?" George leaned back in the chair, looking pensive.
"The Colonel," he began, "told me the story one night. Not long after I had moved into Longbar Farm, and he'd had too much to drink."
Amy could see that George's hands were shaking. She was beginning to wonder whether he really did have arthritis, or whether he had just existed in a permanent state of fear after what sounded to her as a childhood full of abuse and shame.
"In his telling," George said, "his father had acquired the Ran-Tan-Zee in 1857 during the siege of Delhi. When the British had stormed the palace of Bahadur Shah, the last great Mughal, that's where he had found his friend, as he called him. They put Bahadur in chains and shot his sons and his grandson, and all the treasures of the Mughals were carried off in the pockets of the British soldiers. But the Colonel's father came away with something he considered more valuable than gold or precious stones."
George shifted uncomfortably in the chair, and Amy could just imagine the frightened little boy sat across from his slurring, monstrous great-uncle in a cold stone room in the dilapidated farmhouse.
"He set up the Ran-Tan-Zee in the house in Jaipur, a spoil of war, and the Colonel said that it had always been there from his earliest memories," George explained. "The Colonel said that his father had always shown it great respect and reverence, that he now did the same, and that I must do so now too, that I lived under his roof. And if I didn't, terrible things would happen to us both."
Amy looked around the gallery. That feeling she had of all the dead glass eyes of the taxidermied animals staring back at her was growing ever more intense. She could feel a bead of sweat forming on her forehead. Was it the heat from the skylight? It must be nearing 4 o'clock by now, and the museum would have to shut. Amy wondered how long she would have to care for George. How had he even gotten to the museum that day? Where was he staying?
"It wasn't stuffed," George said blankly. "The Colonel was very insistent on that point. The Ran-Tan-Zee was a very special, very clever ape, he said, and that he was just standing very, very still, and would not move if he was being looked at. As in the Mughal court, it was impolite to rush about."
George leaned forward again.
"But if I was a wicked child and had wicked thoughts, then the Ran-Tan-Zee would get me. He would get me like he had gotten the Indian servant boys in the house in Jaipur who had stolen food from the pantry and defied their rightful master, and if the Ran-Tan-Zee got you, you would never be seen again."
Amy could feel her stomach twisting into knots. "That's sick," she whispered, horrified. "Why would you tell something like that to a little kid? Just to scare them?" It was very clear to Amy what all this was about. The Colonel had clearly put the fear of God into young George about this ghastly family heirloom and made a bogeyman to frighten him into obedience.
"You would think that, wouldn't you?" George said cryptically. "A grown-up telling a ghost story to make a child behave. I would prefer that. I could make peace with that. I've had 70 years to make peace with it, but that's not what it was at all, Amy. It was so much worse."
George fumbled for his cane, which Amy passed over to him. She helped him as he heaved himself to his feet, unsteady at first, and then drawing himself up to his full height. "What's wrong, George?" Amy asked, concerned. George furrowed his brow. The memory seemed to be thundering through his head now, bubbling back to the surface.
"He told me that it spoke to him," George said,
staring into the distance, seemingly past Amy's shoulder.
"When he was a boy. The Ran-Tan-Zee, he said,
would come into his room at night and wrap him up in his long, hairy arms and tell him the most wonderful stories about his life. He was a very clever ape and very, very old.
George's story was rapidly taking on the quality of a surreal nightmare for Amy. It felt hyper-real and beyond belief all at once.
He was born in Borneo in 1499. Old Ran-Tan told the colonel, George continued. He was just a young ape when he was captured by Portuguese merchants and whisked away to Malacca, where he entertained the grandchildren of the Governor de Albuquerque with his marvellous tricks. He stayed there 50 years or more and outlived them all until, in 1556, the Portuguese gifted him to the great Mughal Akbar to celebrate his coronation. And it's there that the Ran-Tan-Zee remained, he said, for 301 years at the very heart of the Mughal court. What wonders he told me! That's what the colonel said. What a friend Ran-Tan was to me! The Ran-Tan-Zee had been the childhood playmate of Jahangir, and then his son Shah Jahan. The fierce Aurangzeb had locked him away in the Red Fort for 30 years, for such a clever ape was an insult to the Prophet. The Ran-Tan-Zee had seen the Mughals fall into ruin, their empire shredded by the Hindus and the Persians, the Sikhs, the Afghans and the British. Oh, how Ran-Tan pined for those far-away, fragrant days of the great Akbar, when life was sweet and all the world was holy.
Amy stood holding George's arm to steady him. There were tears in the old man's eyes. Amy didn't know what to think. It was all so unbelievable, like a fairy tale. And yet she could see right before her eyes how much pain George was in, how much the idea of this walking, talking ape had burrowed its way into his mind. Was this why he was now so careworn and grubby, living an isolated life? That's mad, George, Amy finally responded, sounding harsher than she had intended. The Colonel, you must have been mad. George nodded.
He was, he agreed, quite mad. But I believed him, or at least believed that he truly did believe all that he thought Ran-Tan had taught him. He had taken the ape with him everywhere in his life, he told me. He had inherited it after his father died of the plague, had brought it back to England in a tea chest as they sailed through Suez and back to Sussex. It was the one part of his life in India that had not crumbled away to nothing, and he treasured Ran-Tan like it was a priceless gem.
George shuffled slowly in the direction of the door, as if he were intending to leave the gallery as suddenly as he had come. Amy, still dazed, followed after him, for once the attendant making a beeline for the visitor. George, she called out, what happened to it? The Ran-Tan-Zee! George stopped where he stood, his cane tapping against the floor with a resounding echo. He turned slowly to face Amy. It seemed to her as if he were weighing up whether to divulge his last secret, to say something that had never been shared with another soul. His eyes dropped to the ground.
It moved,
George breathed.
The Ran-Tan-Zee. It moved around the house at night. I'd wake up in the morning, and it would be at the top of the stairs, or the kitchen, stock still as always, grinning away like it was up to some great mischief.
Amy stared at George in fascination. The Colonel moved it around? She asked.
George shrugged his shoulder. He swore blind that he didn't. But I heard footsteps at night, and creaking, George said. The Colonel always said that his old friend was protecting the house as always, from wicked little boys who might be sneaking about past their bedtime.
George turned fully to face Amy.
Do you still think I'm not mad, Amy? He asked plainly.
Amy shook her head. She couldn't find the words to respond any more. George considered her with great weariness. He smacked his lips and sighed heavily.
One night,
he said at last, his voice heavy with fear.
Just before I went back home for the start of the school term. I was asleep, but I felt it. The long, hairy arms crawling up my body. I knew it wasn't the Colonel's arms. I knew what those felt like, creeping into my bed. God, I thought I would die. That I would die of fright right there in my bed, and that my parents would never, ever see me again.
George's eyes were wet with tears. His hands shook on the carved snake head of his cane.
I shut my eyes so tightly I thought my head would split open, he continued,
tears now rolling down his cheeks and into his wiry white beard.
I wanted it to end, the whole wretched nightmare of my life in that house. And that's when I heard it, whispering to me. From outside the covers I was hiding under. I said it was just me and the Colonel in the house, and I'm telling you, Amy, that the voice that spoke to me wasn't his, and it wasn't my own. I remember every word.
I am the Ran-Tan-Zee,
it growled in a low, silky voice just like that.
I am the Ran-Tan-Zee. I am a very clever, very special ape. I am a freak. I am very bad. I'm naughty. I play tricks and make mischief, and I eat horrid, sinful children alive and spit out their bones. I am 449 years old. I will live forever. If you ever saw me move, even for a moment, you would petrify, perish, turn into a pillar of salt. The wonders I have seen, little George, the tales I could tell you of Akbar and Jahangir and Aurangzeb. I can sing 1,000 songs in 100 languages. I can juggle and play games. I am everywhere and nowhere and can move so fast you will never catch me. Goodbye, little George, and dream of me forever. You are mine, little George. You are mine. Amy stood rooted to the spot, as if nails had been sunk through her foot, like the stuffed monkey on the branch. She gawped at George, utter dread bristling through her. He looked back at her mournfully.
When I woke up the next morning, it was there, he said blankly. The Ran-Tan-Zee, standing at the foot of my bed. I screamed, of course. The Colonel laughed. One last wretched joke at my expense. I don't know whether he knew it had spoken to me or not.
George looked down at his feet.
My mother collected me later that day, thanked the Colonel for his good care of me. She and my father hadn't visited me once, in all the time I was there. We drove away from Longbar Farm back to Lewis. I turned to look back at the house. The Ran-Tan-Zee was stood at the downstairs window, smiling. The Colonel was stood next to it, waving me goodbye. I never saw him again. They found him dead at the bottom of the stairs the next year. Mother always said he'd had too much to drink, forgotten his crutch, fallen down, broken his neck. Blame me without saying it, like I should have been there to steady him. That's what they said. But I know different. I know that when the woman from the village came to change his sheets, found him rotting on the carpet, that the first thing she would have seen, if she had looked up at the top of the stairs, would be Ran-Tan, staring down at them, smiling his smile, and knowing all he knew and would never tell.
Amy burst into tears. It was too much. the story too dreadful, too weird to take in. She wished George had never come into the gallery, or that she'd never come to work at all that day, had sacked it off and gone to the beach like Mark and Louise clearly had.
Why?
Amy cried, pulling at her long brown hair in distress.
Why, George, why did you tell me? Why do I have to know too?
George reached out his hand, took Amy's, and gave it a comforting squeeze, giving her a sad, knowing smile.
Because someone has to know,
he whispered.
And because I'm going back there. Tonight.
Amy gasped.
Back? To Longbourn Farm?
George nodded.
After the Colonel died, it passed to my uncle,
he said, that strange smile still on his old, worn face.
And after him it went to his son. He died 10 years back, and inheritance being what it is, well, let's just say that I could do with the place what I want now.
George stepped closer to Amy, gripping her arms with his shaking hands.
I've been afraid my whole life, Amy, he said, his voice quivering. I never found anyone to love. I never did anything worthwhile. All because of it. Because of the Ran-Tan-Zee. But now I'm going to do something about it. He's still there. Old Ran-Tan. Pacing about the wreck of that place. Without a master. Without anyone to whisper to. But I'm his master now. I'll be the last master he'll ever have.
George pulled away and turned back to leave the gallery.
Remember me, Amy. Please. Dream of me every now and then. I was alive once.
George was halfway out the door when Amy finally stirred herself.
George!
She croaked, her eyes red with tears. He looked over his shoulder to face her.
What was his name? The boy whose hand you held.
George gave Amy a warm, teary smile.
His name was Peter,
George said.
And he was lovely.
With that, George shuffled out of the gallery, out of the Booth Museum, and out of Amy's life forever. She stood there, in the dimming light of the silent gallery. She turned to face the case where Monkey Christ stood crucified on his log. Just for a moment, Amy could have sworn that his head had always faced the left and not the right. The gulls were twirling above her head, black arrows against the azure blue sky. Amy blinked the sleep from her eyes and gave a dozy, satisfied yawn. Brighton Beach was heaving with visitors, with noise and life. Children laughed and splashed in the sea, young couples sighed over ice creams, and pensioners turned slowly red as they snored away on their deck chairs. Amy smiled to herself. Mark and Louise could cover the museum today, for once. She rolled over on the blanket and wrapped her arm around Cara, who was still lying on her back, legs crossed, sunglasses on, that air of unpractised cool that still gave her butterflies. "Are you actually asleep, babe?" Amy asked teasingly. Cara cocked her a grin. "I was half asleep," she joked, pushing her sunglasses up onto her tangled black hair and turning onto her side to face Amy, resting her head on her arms. "Means I was half awake too. Get all the benefits of sleep without actually having to dream." Amy laughed. "God, you say some weird things." She grinned at Cara. Cara smiled back and tousled her hair playfully. "And you're way too serious," she laughed. "All that time inside, all the quiet, not sure it's good for you." The two of them heaved themselves up to stare out across the sea. It was glimmering in the sunlight, heads bopping up and down in the surf. Amy breathed the salty air deeply. It had been a month since George had visited the museum, a month since she had come home to the flat she shared with Cara and burst into tears. She hadn't explained what had happened to her, not fully, just the vague notion that she had felt she had missed out on a lovely day for no good reason. She told Cara that she loved her, and Cara had told Amy that she loved her too. That was enough, and within a few days the whole surreal experience with George had faded like a half-remembered dream. Amy turned to face Cara. Her smile dropped somewhat to see that Cara had an unusually pensive expression on her face. She was staring out at the sea, her brow furrowed slightly, as if something was on her mind. "You all right, babe?" Amy asked, reaching out a hand and squeezing Cara's. Cara seemed to snap out of her reverie. Oh, sorry, babe. I was miles away. Yeah, I'm fine. Just something weird that happened at work the other day. Amy pulled her legs up to her chest, scooting closer to Kara. Oh? She asked, curious. Yeah, said Kara, rubbing the back of her neck. Me and Dad were out on this job, right, over in Alfriston. Some old farmhouses that the council wanted clearing out before they tear it down and turn it all into new builds. We get there and we can see why. The place is a dump. Didn't look like anyone had lived there for years. Anyway, we're being handed the keys by the guy from the council, right? And I can tell he's all shaken up. Like, his hands were shaking like this. Kara lifted out her hand and shook it to demonstrate. Just like George's hands had shaken. Amy could feel all the blood draining from her face. Kara continued. It was shaking so much, the keys were rattling, so I asked him, hey, you okay, mate? And he says he doesn't like coming back to this place, not after what had happened. Amy looked up at Kara, her breath catching in her throat. What happened? Amy asked, trying to keep her voice level. Well, the way he told it, Kara said in a low voice, the way he told it, he and another guy from the council had been round there a few weeks earlier to check if everything was up to grade. It'd been derelict for a long time, right? But when they opened the door... well, there was a body there. Some old guy. Looked like he'd been dead for days, he said, poor bugger. That's why he was shaking. Said it was the worst thing he'd ever smelled. Amy felt like her heart was ripping in two. The village. The description of the farm. She didn't need to hear any more to know that the old man was George. The thought of him lying dead at the bottom of the stairs, in the exact spot where Colonel Fulton had lain 70 years earlier, made her want to retch. George had never escaped that house, the clutches of his anguish, and in the end it had eaten him alive, all these years later. Poor bugger, was all Amy could sniffle out. Kara gave her a hug. Oh, sorry, babe, she said softly. I didn't mean to upset you. Amy returned the hug. It's just so sad, she said. Dying alone like that. No one even knowing that you've gone. Kara kissed Amy and gave her cheeks a reassuring stroke. Are you okay? Amy asked Kara. Kara nodded, but Amy could see something was still bothering her. Oh, I'm all right, Kara said, sounding unsure. Like, it wasn't like I found him, but... She trailed off. But when we were clearing out the house, chucking everything into the skips or onto the bonfire... God, this is going to sound mad, baby, but... we found this monkey. Like a stuffed chimp or something, like the ones in your museum. Christ, it was the freakiest thing I've ever seen. Dad opened up a cupboard and it was just standing inside, grinning. Like something out of a horror movie. Kara gave an exaggerated shiver. Amy stared out at the sea. All the sounds of laughter and the squawking of gulls seemed to fade away. The words George had told her drifted back into her head, in that low, silky voice that felt like it was eating her alive too.
I will live forever. If you ever saw me move, even for a moment, you would petrify, perish, turn into a pillar of salt. I am everywhere and nowhere and can move so fast you will never catch me. Dream of me forever. You are mine. You are mine.
Amy screwed up her eyes, turned her head so Kara couldn't see her despair. That sounds horrible, she said flatly. What did you do with it? Kara stared out to sea too, the mask of cool cracking ever so slightly. Well, that's the really weird thing, she said finally, her voice filled with an appalled wonder. When we threw it on the bonfire, I could swear that it started to scream. The Ran-Tan-Zee was written and performed by Isaac Hart. The music was by Kevin MacLeod. The script editor was Jennifer Rianne Bartley. Ghost in the Museum will return with a new episode on the 24th of December. Thank you for listening. May we meet again.